Can you cook for two? Nora Cassidy hadn't eaten in 2 days. Her boots had a hole in the left sole. The debt collectors had taken everything that morning, the furniture, the dishes, even the quilt her mother had sewn. And now, a stranger on horseback was looking down at her like she was something worth asking about. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She looked him straight in the eye and said, "I can cook for 10 if you've got a kitchen worth standing in." If this story moves you, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Nora Cassidy walked out of Caldwell had nothing gentle about it. She didn't leave the way a woman leaves when she has a choice. She left the way water leaves a cracked jar slowly then, all at once, with nothing left to hold her in place. The debt collectors had come before sunrise. 3 of them. The lead man had a mustache that sat above his lip like something that had died there, and he read from a paper in a voice that had done this so many times, it had stopped being human. He listed what was owed. He listed what would be taken. He waited exactly 30 seconds for a response, and then he walked past her into the house like she was a doorframe. Nora stood in the front room and watched them carry out the table. She had bought that table 6 months into her marriage to Daniel Cassidy, back when they still believed the ranch would turn. She'd saved for it herself, small coins from selling jars of preserves to Mrs. Aldrin at the dry goods store. It was nothing special. Pine poorly jointed one leg slightly shorter than the others, but she had loved it because it was hers. Because it sat in a room where she had cooked meals and argued about money and laughed at things that weren't even funny, the way married people do when they are comfortable enough to be foolish together. The man with the dead mustache didn't look at the table once. He just told the younger man to take it to the wagon. Nora said, "That table isn't part of the debt." He looked at her. He said, "Ma'am, everything in this structure is collateral, as listed in Section 3 of the agreement your late husband signed." She knew the agreement. She had read it herself. Daniel had not, which was part of the problem. She had read it, and she had told him the numbers didn't work, and he had kissed her on the forehead and said she worried too much. He was not a cruel man. He was just a man who trusted that the ground would hold even when she could see it cracking. He had been wrong, and then he had gotten sick before he could be sorry about it. And then he had died, and the ground had swallowed everything he'd left behind. The table went out the door. Nora didn't move. She stood in the empty room and counted her breathing, and did not cry because crying was something she could not afford at 8 o'clock in the morning with 3 men still moving through her house. By 9 o'clock, they were gone. By 10, she had packed what they hadn't taken: a change of clothes, a small knife, a tinderbox, a photograph of her mother, and 12 cents she'd sewn into the hem of her underskirt 2 years ago and forgotten about until now. 12 cents. She turned them over in her palm and thought about what they could buy, and she almost laughed, but the sound that came out wasn't quite laughter. She walked out of Caldwell without telling anyone she was leaving. There was no one to tell. So, she had a direction, but not a destination. There was a town called Harrow's Fork, about 20 miles northeast, and she had heard it had a boarding house and a diner and enough foot traffic that a woman who could work might find work. That was all she needed. A direction, and the idea that something at the end of it might be possible. The plains in October had a specific quality she had never found a word for. Not cold yet, but done with warmth. The grass had gone to yellow, and the sky stayed low and gray all day, like it was waiting for permission to do something. The wind didn't howl. It just pushed steady and indifferent against her coat, against her face, against the decision she'd made to keep moving. She ate berries she found near a creek bed around midday. They were dry and barely sweet, and tasted like the idea of food rather than food itself. She drank from the creek, crouching on her heels, the way she'd learned as a girl in Missouri, and she let the cold water run over her fingers for a moment before she stood back up. Keep moving. That was the only rule she had. By mid-afternoon, her feet were wrong. The hole in her left boot had let in moisture from the grass, and the wet had worked its way into her sock and up through her ankle, and every step on that side had a specific miserable quality to it that required concentration to ignore. She concentrated. She kept moving. She thought about Daniel exactly once, And then she put him away because thinking about him required a kind of emotion she couldn't spend right now. She would think about him later when she had a roof and something warm in her stomach. She would be sad properly with time and stillness. Right now she needed the 20 cents her legs cost her per mile, and she couldn't afford the drain. The afternoon stretched. The light came sideways through the clouds the way it does in autumn, when the sun has given up on being overhead. And then her legs gave out. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a fall, not exactly. It was more like her body simply stopped negotiating. She had been pushing against the cumulative weight of the last 2 days, no real food, no sleep, the hours of walking, and her body finally submitted the bill and refused to wait for payment. Her knees buckled. She caught herself on the fence post, a split-rail fence running along the edge of a property she'd been walking beside for the last quarter mile, and she hung there for a moment with her forehead against the wood and her breathing coming in the wrong rhythm. She wasn't going to cry. She just needed a minute. She was still telling herself that when she heard the horse. He came from the north side of the property, moving at a slow walk, the kind of pace a man uses when he's not in a hurry, because hurrying is no longer a language he speaks. The horse was a gray roan, big and quiet, and the man on it matched the animal in some way. She couldn't immediately name both of them, long and unhurried and faintly weathered like things that had been in the elements long enough to stop fighting them. He pulled up about 10 feet from her and looked at her, not the way men usually looked at a woman alone at a fence post in the middle of nowhere. He didn't calculate. He didn't soften into concern too quickly. He just looked the way a man looks at something he is trying to understand honestly. She made herself stand up straight. She took her forehead off the fence post. She met his eyes. "I'm fine," she said, and even she didn't believe it. He didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at her boots. He looked at her coat. He looked at the bag over her shoulder and the way she was holding the fence post with one hand in a manner that was meant to look casual and wasn't. Then he said, "You come from Caldwell?" "Yes." "You going to Harrow's Fork?" That was the idea. He looked back the way she'd come, the way a man does when he's doing arithmetic in his head. 20 miles out of Caldwell. The Fork was still another 4 miles northeast. She'd come farther than she'd thought, which was something, but not enough of something. "You got someone waiting for you there?" he asked. "No." "Work lined up?" "Not yet." He nodded slowly, like her answers were confirming something he'd already suspected. He shifted in the saddle. He was quiet for long enough that she thought the conversation might be over, that he'd tip his hat and ride on, and leave her to her fence post and her 12 cents and her plan. Then he asked so quietly, she almost thought she'd misheard it. "Can you cook for 2?" Nora straightened all the way. She let go of the fence post. "I can cook for 10, she said, "if you've got a kitchen worth standing in." Something moved across his face. It was brief and unreadable, and then it was gone. "It's not much of a kitchen," he said. "But it's there." His name was Ellis Brand. He said it plainly, like a man accustomed to facts, when he helped her onto the horse behind him. He didn't make it awkward. He didn't make a gesture of it. He just extended his hand and said, "Ellis Brand," and waited for her to take it, and then he pulled her up, and that was that. She told him her name, and he nodded once, and didn't repeat it back the way people do when they're performing friendliness. He just nudged the horse north, and they rode. The ranch came into view after about a mile. It was larger than she'd expected. Not prosperous, but substantial. The kind of place that had once had ambition, and was now sustaining what ambition had built. Fences that needed work, but hadn't yet failed. A barn that listed slightly, but stood. A bunkhouse with smoke coming from the chimney, which meant men, which was something she noted and filed away. The main house was 2 stories. It had a porch that ran the width of the front face. It needed paint badly, but the bones of it were sound. Ellis stopped the horse near the porch steps and helped her down. Not with ceremony, just practically because the horse was tall and her legs were not in their best condition. "The men eat at 6, he said. "There are usually 5 of them, sometimes 4. They're not complicated. Beef if there is, it otherwise whatever there is. Coffee in the morning always. Nora looked at the house. What about you? Same. Do you eat with them? Sometimes. She nodded. I'll need to see what's in the kitchen. I'll show you. The kitchen was worse than not much. It was exactly what happens when men have been feeding themselves, for she would later learn 3 years without a woman's hand in it. Not dirty in a malicious way. Dirty in the specific way of neglect, grease built up on surfaces that had been wiped but never scrubbed, flour in a sack that had been open to the air too long. A cast iron skillet with carbon crusted into the grooves that would take serious time and serious effort to reclaim. Shelves that had never been organized, just accumulated. A stove that worked, she checked it immediately, that was always her first check, but that had never been cleaned around the flue properly. She stood in the middle of it and turned a slow circle. Ellis stood in the doorway. I told you it wasn't much. I've seen worse, she said. Which was not entirely true, but was not entirely a lie either. There's a room off the back hall, he said. Small. It was used for storage. We cleared it out about a week ago. She looked at him. You were expecting someone. I put out word at the church in Caldwell 2 weeks ago that I needed a cook. No one came. She thought about that, about the timing of it. About the fact that she had walked out of Caldwell that morning with nowhere to go and ended up at this fence exactly when a man who needed exactly what she had to offer was riding past. She didn't say anything about it. She wasn't the kind of woman who read Providence into coincidence. She was the kind of woman who took what was in front of her and made it work. I'll need to know what you can spend on supplies, she said. Talk to me after you have seen what's here, Ellis said. Sometimes I'm surprised. He left her to it. She spent the rest of that afternoon in the kitchen. She found potatoes. She found dried beans, a good amount of them, which was something. She found salt pork that was still serviceable, and cornmeal, and a small tin of lard that was better than expected. She found coffee, which elevated everything. She found on the very back of the bottom shelf behind a broken lantern and a coil of rope that had no business being in a kitchen, a jar of peach preserves. Sealed. Still good. She held it up to the light from the window and looked at it for a moment. She put it on the shelf where she could see it and got to work. By 6 o'clock, she had a pot of beans with salt pork and cornbread in the oven and coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. It was not elegant. It was exactly what the ingredients allowed, which meant it was competent and warm and filling, which was more than these men had been getting. She could tell from the way they ate. They filed in from the bunkhouse, 5 of them ranging from a boy of maybe 17 to a man with white in his beard who moved like someone whose knees had opinions, and they sat at the long table in the kitchen without ceremony or conversation. They were not unfriendly. They were just men who ate because eating was what you did after work, not because eating was an occasion. The first one to take a bite was the boy. He chewed. He looked at his bowl. He looked at the cornbread. He took another bite. Then he said quietly to no one in particular, "This is good." The older man with the white beard said, "Hush, Teddy, and eat it before it gets cold." But he said it the way you say something you agree with. Nora stood at the stove and drank her coffee and watched them eat and felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't felt in months. Not happiness, she wasn't there yet, but something close to steadiness. Something that felt like competence returning to her hands after too long away. Ellis came in near the end. He hadn't eaten with them. He'd been in the barn, she gathered from the way he moved when he entered, careful, in the way a man moves when he's tired but doesn't want to show it. He poured himself coffee. He looked at the pot on the stove. "Sit," she said. "I'll bring it." He didn't argue. He sat at the end of the table, away from where the men had been, in a spot that was clearly his, by some long-established logic she hadn't had to be told. She set a bowl in front of him. She put the cornbread beside it. He looked at it for a moment. Then he said simply, "Thank you." She went back to the stove and said nothing, but the word settled somewhere in her chest that had been cold for a long time. That first week was just work. That was all she wanted it to be, and all she let it become. She woke before anyone else, and lit the stove, and started the coffee, and thought about what could be done with what she had. She cleaned the kitchen in stages, not all at once, because she couldn't afford to have it out of commission, but methodically, section by section, the way you eat something large, one piece at a time until it's gone. The skillet alone took 3 separate sessions, and language she normally kept private. The men noticed. Not all at once. In the specific way men notice things, one of them would come in for breakfast and look at a shelf that had been reorganized and not say anything, but stand there for an extra second, like the shelf had moved and he was orienting himself. Teddy, the young one, started putting things back in the right place without being asked. She noticed that, and didn't mention it because mentioning it would have made it awkward, and she wanted it to keep happening. The food got better as she figured out the store's and the stove's personality. Every stove has one, and as Ellis began bringing in supplies from his trips to Caldwell, with more attention to what she'd mentioned needing. He didn't always get exactly what she'd asked for, but he listened. That was more than she'd expected. On Wednesday of that first week, she found a cast-iron Dutch oven in the barn. She had gone out there for no reason she could immediately name. She'd heard a sound and followed it, and found the barn empty except for the horses and the Dutch oven hanging from a hook behind the tack wall, covered in dust and spider silk, abandoned and perfect. She lifted it down and carried it to the kitchen, and she could tell from the way Ellis looked at it when he came in that evening that he hadn't known it was there. "Where did you find that?" he asked. "Behind the saddle rack." He looked at it for a moment. Then he said, "That was my wife's." The air in the kitchen changed. Nora set it on the stove carefully. "I can put it back," she said. "No." He said it quickly, then more slowly. "No. Use it. That's what it's for." She nodded and didn't say anything else. And he poured his coffee and didn't say anything else, and that was the conversation, but it was the longest conversation they'd had yet. She learned him in pieces the way you learn anything in a quiet house where no one volunteers information. Ellis Brand was 38 years old. He had been on this land for 12 years, first as a hired hand, and then as the owner, after a complicated arrangement with the previous owner that no one seemed to want to explain in detail. He had married a woman named Clara about 8 years ago. Clara had died the fever 2 winters past, and since then he had run the ranch with his 5 men and gotten through days the way a man gets through days when he stopped expecting them to add up to something. She didn't learn this from Ellis. She learned it from the men in fragments over meals. Teddy was the most talkative of them once he decided she wasn't going to cause problems. The man with the white beard, whose name was Garrett, she learned which suited him, was the one who confirmed things that Teddy said in the way he either agreed or stayed quiet. What she learned about Ellis from Ellis himself was smaller and more specific. He took his coffee black. He came in from the range later than the other men almost always. He ate without complaint, but he noticed when things were different, and once or twice she caught him looking at something she'd made with an expression that wasn't quite surprise but was something adjacent to it. He always said thank you. He never asked her about herself. That last thing should have made her feel invisible. Instead, it made her feel in a strange way free. She had been asked about herself so much in the months since Daniel's death. The neighbors, the church women, the debt collectors in their oblique way, and every question had felt like an excavation, like people were looking for the soft center of her grief, so they could either feel sorry for her or use it against her. Ellis didn't ask. He treated her like a person doing a job in a house, which was all she was, and it felt like dignity. She started to breathe differently in the second week, deeper, with less of the held-in quality she'd been carrying since Caldwell. She started to sleep properly, which she hadn't done since before Daniel got sick. She started to notice things about the house that weren't just tasks. The way the morning light came through the kitchen window before the clouds thickened, the way the stove ticked to itself when it was warming up. The way the floorboard outside Ellis's study announced him before he appeared in the kitchen doorway, so that she always knew he was coming, and had a moment to compose herself before he arrived. She told herself that last one was practical. She wasn't sure she believed it.
Chapter 2.
At the end of the second week, Garrett sat down at the kitchen table after supper while she was washing up and said without preamble, "You're staying." It wasn't a question. Nora kept washing. "That's between Mr. Brand and me." "He'll keep you," Garrett said. "If you're wondering. He doesn't say much, but he'd tell me if it wasn't working out, and he hasn't. Which for him is about the same as saying it's working out." She turned to look at him. He was a man who didn't say things without meaning them. She'd figured that out quickly. "What was it like before?" she asked. "The food." Garrett's expression shifted into something that might, on a less weathered face, have been called rueful. Teddy was doing most of it. Boys willing, but his biscuits were a public health concern. She turned back to her washing. "I found a biscuit tin in the back of the pantry." "Don't open it," Garrett said. She laughed. It surprised her the way it came out sudden and real without her deciding to do it. She hadn't laughed in months, and the sound was unfamiliar to her, like hearing your own voice on a recording. Garrett smiled, which was a small event on his face. He got up and took his coffee and went out. Nora stood at the sink for a moment, her hands still in the water, and listened to the sounds of the house settling around her. She didn't let herself think the word home, but it was there just at the edge of her mind, waiting with a patience she wasn't prepared for. 3 weeks in, something shifted. She couldn't have said exactly when it happened or what changed specifically because it wasn't one thing. It was the accumulation of small specific moments, the way water accumulates in a vessel that you're not watching closely, too slow to notice, and then suddenly it's full. Ellis had started coming in from the range with an expression that was not happy. That wasn't the right word, and she wasn't certain it was in his vocabulary, but different from the expression he'd worn in that first week. Less sealed. Like a man who's been outside in the cold and is beginning to thaw without quite meaning to. On Thursday of the 3rd week, he came in while she was working out a pie with the last of some dried apples she'd found in a crock that had been pushed to the very back of a high shelf, too far back for a man who wasn't looking to find. She hadn't said she was making it. She'd just done it because the apples needed using, and she had the time. He came in and stopped. He stood there and looked at the pie tin on the counter, the way a man looks at something he wasn't expecting and isn't sure how to hold. Then he said quietly, "Clara used to make apple pie in October." Nora put down the rolling pin. She didn't look at him because she could hear in his voice that he hadn't quite meant to say it, and looking at him would make it worse. "I can make something else," she said. "If it's—" "No," he said, the same quick way he'd said it about the Dutch oven. Then, "No, it's good, I just—" He stopped. He picked up his coffee mug from the shelf where he'd left it that morning. "It smells right," he said, and went back out. She stood in the kitchen for a moment after he left. She picked the rolling pin back up. She thought about a man who described the smell of pie as smelling right, as if rightness was the thing he'd been missing, as if the world had simply been wrong smelling for 2 years, and he didn't know how to say that any other way. She felt something she had told herself she wasn't going to feel. She put it away firmly and rolled out the crust. But later, when she brought a slice to his study after supper, she hadn't meant to. She'd just been passing the door, and the slice was in her hand, and he looked up from his ledger and looked at the plate and then looked at her. She noticed that the thing she'd put away was still there, waiting. Same as the word she hadn't let herself say. Home was patient. It could wait. The pie was gone by morning. Not just her slice and Ellis's. All of it. She found the empty tin on the counter when she came down to start the stove, wiped nearly clean in the way of men who don't want to be caught appreciating something too openly. She looked at it for a moment, turned it over in her hands, then set it to soak, and started the coffee, and didn't say a word about it to anyone. But Teddy came in for breakfast with a look on his face like a man who had gotten away with something, and Garrett came in behind him with the specific dignity of a person who had eaten pie at midnight and intended to take that information to his grave. "Sleep well?" Nora asked, not looking up from the eggs. "Fine," Garrett said. "Good," she said. That was the whole conversation, but it was a different kind of silence than the first week's silence. The first week had been the silence of strangers being careful. This was the silence of people who had already negotiated something without words and were comfortable inside it. She was starting to understand how this house communicated. The work expanded as she settled into it the way work always does when someone is actually paying attention. She began to see not just what needed doing in the kitchen, but what the whole house needed: small things, specific things, the kind of thing that accumulates when there's no one whose job it is to notice. A window latch that didn't catch properly and let cold air slide in along the sill every time the wind came from the north. A step on the back staircase that had gone soft and would eventually give way under someone's boot and send them down hard. Curtains in the main room that had faded to the color of old newspaper and let in more cold than light. She didn't ask permission. She fixed the latch herself with a piece of wire she found in the shed. She mentioned the step to Garrett because he was the one who seemed to have a practical knowledge of the property's needs, and he had it shored up by afternoon. The curtains she set aside as a project for later when she had time and material. Ellis noticed the latch on a Wednesday evening. She watched him put his hand on the window frame. Out of habit, he'd been doing it for months. She could tell the automatic reach of a man who'd learned to hold the window against the draft. And then his hand met the solid catch and he paused. He looked at the latch. He looked at her. She was stirring something on the stove and kept her eyes there. He said nothing. He sat down and poured his coffee. But later, as she was setting the supper table, she heard him in the next room say something quiet to Garrett that she couldn't make out, and Garrett said something back, and then there was a pause, and Garrett said louder, but still not loud enough to be meant for her ears. She doesn't wait to be asked. That's the difference. She kept setting the table. She filed it away in the part of her that was keeping track. November came in cold and certain. The ranch contracted inward the way working ranches do. As the season turns, fewer hours outside, more time spent on close work. The kind of maintenance and preparation that defines the gap between ranches that survive winter and ranches that don't. The men were in the barn more. Ellis was at his desk more. The house held more people for more hours and became louder in a specific inhabited way she hadn't expected to like and did. She expanded the meals. Not in extravagance. She had no budget for extravagance and wouldn't have spent it that way if she had, but in care. She made stock from bones. She made bread twice a week because fresh bread is one of the things that the cold calls for in a way that nothing else answers. She made a pot of soup that was technically beans and ham hock and onion, but was in practice something that caused Teddy to eat 3 bowls without speaking and then sit back in his chair and look at the ceiling like a man who has briefly encountered God. "That's the same soup my grandmother made," he said to no one in particular. Garrett said, "Your grandmother was from Missouri." Teddy looked at Nora. "Are you from Missouri?" "I am," she said. He nodded, like this explained something fundamental about the nature of the universe. Ellis at his end of the table said nothing. But she caught the small shift at the corner of his mouth, the thing that happened on his face sometimes when something pleased him and he didn't want to act pleased, and she looked away before he could notice she'd seen it. It was the bread that undid something, though she wouldn't admit it that way at the time. She had been baking the second loaf of a Thursday batch when Ellis appeared in the kitchen doorway mid-morning. Which he never did, not usually mid-morning, was when he was out with the men or in the barn or in his study. Working numbers she had not yet seen, but was beginning to understand, were worrying him. He stood there for a moment, like he wasn't sure what had drawn him in, and she didn't look up from the counter because she was in the middle of something that required attention. "You don't have to make 2, he said. "1 gets eaten before it cools," she said. 2 lasts through the next morning. He came in properly then. Not to eat. He'd already had breakfast, but in the way of a man who has been alone with his own thinking too long and needs something different in the air around him. He poured coffee. He stood at the counter with his mug and watched her work, and she let him, because she had 4 siblings, and she knew the difference between watching that intrudes and watching that simply needs company. "How long were you married?" he asked. She kept kneading. 4 years. Were you? He stopped, started again. Did you know before he died that the debt had gotten that far? She thought about lying. She thought about the polite version, the one that protected Daniel. Then she thought about the fact that this man had a study full of papers that were worrying him, and he was standing in her kitchen mid-morning on a Thursday, and those two things were probably connected. Yes, she said. I knew. Did he? She pressed the heel of her hand into the dough. He knew and he didn't know, if that makes sense. He knew the numbers were bad. He didn't believe the outcome was possible. Some people can't see the end of a road until they're standing at it. Ellis was quiet for a moment. I understand that, he said in a voice that meant he understood it from the inside. She let that sit for a moment before she spoke again. Are you standing at a road, Mr. Brand? He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, not yet, but I can see it from here. She turned the dough and didn't look at him. Is it the cattle prices? Another pause. What do you know about cattle prices? I was a rancher's wife for 4 years. I kept his books when he let me. She glanced up briefly. He didn't always let me. Ellis looked at her for a moment, the longer assessing look that he used when he was recalibrating something. The prices dropped in September, he said. We had a hard autumn, lost 3 head to something we never identified. The winter supplies cost more than I estimated. She nodded slowly. Can I see the ledger? He said nothing for a long moment, not because he was offended she could read that much about him by now. He was simply deciding. There was a privacy to a ledger, a vulnerability that was particular to men who had built things with their hands and didn't like to show the seams. After supper, he said. If you want. She shaped the loaf and said, I want. She looked at the ledger after supper while the men were in the bunkhouse and the house was quiet. Ellis sat across the table from her with his coffee and let her go through it at her own speed, which she appreciated because she needed to go through it twice, once for the raw numbers and once to understand the reasoning behind them. The reasoning behind some of them was sound. The reasoning behind others was the reasoning of a man who was good with land and cattle and had a loose grasp on the way money moved, in the particular modern way it was beginning to move in Wyoming Territory in 1883, which was more complicated than it had been 10 years ago and would be more complicated still in 10 more. There was a bank loan from 2 years ago after Clara's illness. She noted, though she didn't say it, that had terms that were aggressive and had been signed without she suspected being read closely enough. She recognized that error. She looked at the interest rate. She set her jaw. This rate, she said, keeping her voice even. Did you negotiate this, or did they present it as standard? Ellis looked at where her finger was on the page. They said it was what they offered for agricultural loans. It's not, she said. Or if it is, it's the high end of what they offer, and they offer it to people they think won't ask questions. She looked up. Did you ask questions? He held her gaze. It was a long moment. I was not... He stopped. My wife had just died. I needed the capital to keep the ranch running through spring. I signed what they put in front of me. She nodded once and looked back at the ledger. She said nothing else about it because it was done, and the only useful thing was what came next. But she felt something sharp and specific on his behalf. Not pity, she didn't think, but something close to a woman's particular fury at the way certain people treat a grieving man like an opportunity. All right, she said. Here is what I see. She walked him through it methodically. The places the spending could be adjusted, the feed costs that were higher than they needed to be because of who he was buying from and what alternatives existed, the cattle that were underperforming relative to what the land could carry, which suggested a management question rather than a capacity problem, the loan terms, which were the most serious issue, and the one she was least sure how to address from this table with this ledger. Ellis listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't get defensive, which she had half expected, because in her experience, men with ledgers often got defensive when a woman pointed at the wrong numbers. He just listened and occasionally asked a question, short specific questions that told her he was tracking every word. And when she was done, he looked at the page for a long moment and then looked at her. "You should have been keeping the books for your husband," he said. "I know," she said. "He knew it too by the end." Another silence. Then quietly, "Would you, if I asked you, would you be willing to look at these regularly, not just tonight?" She looked at him across the table. The lamp between them made everything sharp-edged and close. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at her over the fence that first day, trying to see something clearly without agenda or flattery, just the honest assessment of a man trying to understand what was in front of him. "Yes," she said. "I'd be willing." He nodded. He picked up his coffee. He looked back at the ledger, and she saw in his face something she hadn't expected: relief. Not the small, everyday kind. The kind that comes when a person has been carrying something alone for a long time, and someone has just put their hand on the other end of it. She looked down at the numbers again and told herself that was all it was. Practical. Useful. A woman with a head for figures and a man who needed one. She told herself that clearly. It didn't entirely work. The first real trouble came on a Friday, and it came from inside the bunkhouse. She had known in the peripheral awareness you develop in any place where you're the only woman among a group of men that not all 5 of the ranch hands had adjusted equally to her presence. 4 of them had either been glad of the food and the order she'd brought, or were simply indifferent to her in a way that posed no problem. The 5th, a man named Rafe Colton, somewhere in his mid-30s, with a manner that was not openly rude but sat too close to the line, had been a different matter from the first week. Rafe didn't say anything directly. He was too careful for that or too uncertain. What he did was smaller. He was the last to acknowledge her when she came into a room, the first to push back from the table without a word. The one who sometimes asked for things in a tone that was just barely on the wrong side of how you ask a person, as opposed to how you tell a piece of furniture what to do. She managed it. That was her skill. She managed things without making scenes, because scenes cost energy, and she had work to do. But the Friday it escalated started with coffee. She had been up since before dawn. The bread required it, and she had the kitchen running and the breakfast ready, and she was finishing the last of the setup when Rafe came in early, which he didn't usually do, and poured himself coffee from the pot she'd just made, and then said to the room in general, as if speaking to no one in particular, even though she was the only other person there. Getting cold enough that a man needs someone to keep the bed warm, too, not just the kitchen. The room went completely still. Nora set down the spoon she was holding. She turned around. She looked at him directly the way her mother had taught her, not with heat, because heat gives a man like that the argument he's looking for, but with a steadiness that makes it very clear you know exactly what was just said and you're deciding what to do about it. "I'd mind your coffee," she said. "It's hot." Rafe smiled, which was worse than if he'd frowned. "Just making conversation." "That wasn't conversation," she said. "And we both know it. Say it again, and you'll be having the conversation with Mr. Brand." The smile didn't entirely leave his face, but something shifted behind his eyes, a reassessment. He picked up his coffee and went back out, and she turned back to the stove with a steadiness she didn't entirely feel. She didn't tell Ellis. Not that morning. But Garrett had been coming in behind Rafe, she realized later. Had been at the door when it happened. She found that out because Garrett said nothing about it directly, but that afternoon he arranged himself near the kitchen whenever Rafe was nearby in a way that was too deliberate to be accidental. Garrett was not a complicated man, and she liked him enormously for it. The situation resolved itself 3 days later. She didn't know exactly what was said or who said it. She only knew that on Monday evening, Ellis asked her if she'd had any trouble with any of the men, and she looked at him and understood that someone had already told him something. "Nothing I couldn't handle," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "That's not what I asked." She held his gaze. "Rafe Colton made a comment. I addressed it. It hasn't happened again." Ellis nodded slowly. Something in his jaw had changed, a tightening subtle, but there. "If it does," he said, "you tell me directly. Not after." "I will." He looked at her for another moment, like he wanted to say something else, and was deciding against it. Then he nodded once more and went back to his study. The next morning, Rafe ate breakfast without looking at her. He left for the range with the other men. He came back at supper and ate and said nothing. And whatever had been adjusted in that bunkhouse conversation she hadn't heard had apparently stuck, because that was the last of it. But she registered what Ellis had said. "You tell me directly." It was not the instruction of a man who considered her a cook and nothing else. It was the instruction of a man who was, however slowly, however guardedly, thinking of her as someone whose well-being was his concern. She registered that. She filed it somewhere careful. The thing about doing the job well is that it changes you, not just the thing you're doing. Nora had known this in an abstract way, the knowledge that comes from being raised by a woman who took competence seriously as a moral value. But she understood it differently now in her body, in the specific daily rhythm of this house. She had come here hollow in a way she hadn't admitted to herself, hollowed by grief and debt, and the long, slow failure of things she'd tried to hold together, and the work had been filling her back in. The same way it had changed the kitchen, the same way it had changed the air in the main room, it was changing her. Giving her back her edges. She started to have opinions again, small ones at first. She had an opinion about where the firewood should be stacked relative to the back door. She had an opinion about how Teddy held a knife when he helped her in the kitchen on rainy afternoons, when there was nothing else for him to do. He held it like he was afraid it was going to run away from him, which meant his cuts were inconsistent and his knuckles were always in danger. She taught him the right grip without making a production of it. He practiced it with the concentration of someone learning something that mattered. Larger opinions came after. She had an opinion, private but distinct, about the feed supplier Ellis was using in Caldwell because the quality had been inconsistent for the last 2 deliveries, and the price hadn't moved to match the quality, and that was either sloppiness or something less innocent, and either way it was costing the ranch money it didn't have to spare. She mentioned this carefully one evening when they were at the ledger together. Ellis looked at her. "Matt's been supplying this ranch for 6 years. "That doesn't mean he's done it well for 6 years, she said. "It means no one's checked in 6 years. She slid a page toward him. "Look at the purchase weight versus the estimated yield. These 3 deliveries going back to June." He looked. He was quiet. "It could be poor record keeping," she said. "It could be other things." "What other things?" She looked at him steadily. "What do you think?" He looked at the numbers for another long moment. Then he said quietly, with the specific quiet of a man who is not pleased with what he's realized, "I'll ride to Caldwell Monday." "I can come," she said. He looked up. "You'd want to—" "I'd want to be useful," she said. "And I know what to look for." He studied her for a moment. Then he nodded. "Monday," he said. They rode into Caldwell together on a gray Monday morning, which was the first time she had been back to that town since she'd walked out of it 6 weeks ago with 12 cents and a hole in her boot. She had bought new boots. That was one of the things Ellis had set to almost immediately. He'd said it in his plain-spoken way sometime in the 3rd week. "You need proper boots. Get what you need in Caldwell next time I go. I'll take it from your wages." It had not been offered as charity. It had been offered as a practical acknowledgement that a woman running a ranch kitchen could not do so effectively in failing footwear, which was exactly the right reason and the only one she would have accepted. She sat the horse better now, too. She'd been riding again since the 2nd week, small errands around the property, and it had come back to her the way physical knowledge does when it's been built into muscle, not quickly, but reliably. Caldwell looked the same as it always had, which was both a relief and a specific kind of ache. She did not look at the house where she'd lived with Daniel. She kept her eyes ahead and thought about the feed supplier and let that fill the space where the other feeling wanted to be. The conversation with Mast was short and not pleasant. Ellis did the talking she had suggested he do the talking, and she would watch, which he had accepted, without needing the reason explained, and she watched. She watched the way Mast answered questions about the weight discrepancies. She watched the way his hands moved when he talked about the June and August deliveries. She watched the way he looked at the ledger pages Ellis put in front of him, with an expression that was not the expression of a man encountering a mistake he'd made, but the expression of a man deciding which lie to tell. After, on the street outside, Ellis said to her, "Well," she said, "he's skimming weight. Has been for at least 4 months, probably longer. It's not a mistake." Ellis was quiet for a moment. "You're sure?" "I've seen it before," she said. "The way he looked at the June entry, he knew exactly which month you meant before he opened the book." Another quiet moment. Then Ellis Brand said something she would think about for a long time after. "I should have looked at this 6 months ago." "Yes," she said, because lying to him would have been a disrespect he didn't deserve. "But you're looking at it now." He glanced at her. Something in his expression that was not quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood. "Is that your way of being kind?" he asked. "It's my way of being accurate," she said. He made a sound, brief, low, that she realized after a moment was a laugh. She hadn't heard that before from him. It was quieter than she expected, and it did something to her that she immediately addressed by looking up the street and pointing out that there was a different feed merchant near the east end of town, whose prices she'd been told were competitive. They rode home with a new supply arrangement and a termination of the old one, and $3 more a month that would stay in the ranch account rather than in Mast's pocket. On the ride back, they talked more than they had in all the previous weeks combined. Not about the ranch they'd covered that, about other things. She told him about Missouri a little, about her mother's kitchen, which had been the warmest place she'd known as a girl. He told her slowly, in the way of a man taking something out of a box he normally keeps locked, about buying this land. About the first winter when the pipes froze and one of the cattle walls came down in a storm, and he'd spent 3 days rebuilding it in temperatures that should have made it impossible. "Why did you stay?" she asked. He thought about it. "Because giving up would have meant it had all been wrong," he said, "and I needed it to have been right." She understood that completely. She said so. He looked at her sideways the way he did when something she said landed with more weight than he'd expected. Then he looked back at the road. They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was the warmest silence she'd experienced since before Daniel was sick, since the time when silence between two people meant they were comfortable enough not to need words. She noticed it. She told herself she was simply tired from the ride. She was starting to run out of things to tell herself. It was Teddy who said it first, with the specific indiscretion of youth. He said it on a Tuesday evening to Garrett, but at the volume of a person who hasn't yet learned that walls are thin. She was in the kitchen, and they were in the next room, and he said with the uncomplicated certainty of 19 years old, "He's different since she came." Garrett said something too low to hear. Teddy said, "Good different. Like he's, I don't know. Like he remembers there's a reason to come inside." She stood at the counter and heard that and held very still for a moment. Then she went back to what she was doing. But the feeling that had been waiting at the edge of her mind, the one she hadn't let herself name, had just taken one quiet, certain step closer, and she was not sure she had the energy left to keep it at the distance she'd been keeping it. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard announced Ellis coming down the hallway. She heard him stop outside the kitchen door. He didn't come in right away. He stood there for a moment on the other side of the door, and she thought about the fact that she could tell it was him from the specific sound of his step, and that knowing that about a person was the kind of knowing that didn't stay manageable for very long. He came in. "You're still up," he said. "There's bread tomorrow," she said. "I was thinking through the amounts." He poured his coffee and leaned against the counter and looked at her, and she let herself look back just briefly, just long enough to see what was in his face, which was something careful and uncertain and real. Something that had not been in his face 6 weeks ago, when he'd pulled her up onto his horse and ridden home without promises. She looked back at the counter. "Get some sleep," he said finally. "The bread will sort itself out." She almost said what was in her chest. She didn't. She said good night and let him go, and then stood in the kitchen by herself and listened to the house settle around her and thought about a man who had come alive by degrees so slowly she'd almost missed it, the way you almost miss the moment winter begins to turn. She hadn't missed it. She just wasn't ready for what came next. She didn't sleep well that night. Not because anything had been said, because of everything that hadn't been. She lay in the small room off the back hall and listened to the house settle into the deep cold of a November night, and thought about the way Ellis had looked at her in the kitchen, that careful, uncertain look that had no performance in it, no calculation, just a man seeing something he hadn't prepared himself to see. And she thought about Teddy's voice through the wall, saying like he remembers, "There's a reason to come inside," and she thought about the floorboard that announced him and the way she'd catalogued it without deciding to. She was in trouble. She had known it for at least a week, and she had managed it the way she managed most things, by keeping her hands busy and her mind on practical matters and not looking directly at the feeling, the way you don't look directly at something bright if you want to be able to see anything else afterward. But lying still in the dark, with no bread to make and no ledger to study, it was harder to manage. The feeling sat in her chest, patient and warm, and completely unwilling to be reasoned with. She was not a foolish woman. She knew the difference between gratitude and something more, between the warmth of security and the specific, inconvenient warmth of caring about a specific person. She'd felt this before 16 years old, and certain then 22 and surer, and she knew its texture. It felt like this. Exactly like this. She got up before the stove needed lighting, sat at the edge of her bed, and had a conversation with herself that was clear-eyed and practical, and arrived at the following conclusions. She was employed by this man. She was living under his roof. She had been here less than 2 months. She did not know enough about him, and he had not said anything that could reasonably be interpreted as more than decency and growing trust. Those were the facts. She would live inside the facts. She got up. She lit the stove. She started the coffee. She was halfway through the bread dough when she heard his door. He came in early that morning, earlier than usual, which was already earlier than any of the other men. He looked like someone who also hadn't slept particularly well, which she registered and filed immediately into the part of her mind that she was trying to keep quiet. He poured coffee. He looked at the dough. He looked at her. "You're starting early," he said. "Couldn't sleep," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Cold." "No, just thinking." He nodded like that was a sufficient and complete answer and sat down at the table. Not at his usual spot at the end, at the near end, closer to where she was working. She noticed the change in position and kept her eyes on the dough. They were quiet together for a while, and it was the kind of quiet she'd learned to be careful around, because it had substance in it, weight, the kind of quiet that meant both people were thinking about something they hadn't said. Then he said, "Nora." She looked up. He was looking at her coffee mug, which she'd set down and hadn't picked back up, and his expression was the particular careful expression of a man about to say something he's rehearsed and isn't sure about. "The situation with Mast," he said. "I should have seen that. What you found in an afternoon, I'd been walking past it for months." She waited because that wasn't the whole thing. "I want you to know," he said slowly, "that what you do here, it's more than cooking. You know that. I want to make sure you know that I know that." She looked at him steadily. "Why this morning?" He met her eyes. "Because I've been owing you that sentence for a while, and I kept finding reasons not to say it." Something in her chest moved. She held it. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and picked up his coffee, and that was the end of it, but it wasn't the end of anything. The second week of November arrived with ice on the pump handle every morning, and the specific sound of winter claiming territory it had been approaching for weeks. The men worked shorter days outside, and longer days in the barn, and the bunkhouse and the kitchen became the warm center of gravity that everything else orbited. She cooked for longer windows, kept things hot, kept coffee ready at all hours, and found a satisfaction in it that she recognized as belonging to something larger than the job. She was building something. She understood that now, with a clarity she hadn't had in the first weeks. Not just the meals, not just the ledger work. Something she didn't have a precise word for, a kind of ordered life, a warmth that went into corners of a house that had been cold for years. She could feel it the same way you feel a room temperature shift gradually, and then undeniably. Ellis felt it too. She could tell because he began to change in small, specific ways that she would have missed if she hadn't been paying the kind of attention she was trying not to pay. He started coming in from the range earlier. Not dramatically 15 minutes, sometimes 20, but consistently enough that she noticed. She started having supper ready at that earlier time without either of them having discussed it, and the first evening she put a plate in front of him at the new time. He looked at her for just a second, with something in his eyes that was close to undone. He didn't comment on it. She didn't either. They had gotten very good at not commenting on things. Chapter. The letter arrived on a Thursday. One of the hands brought it in from the post in Caldwell, a thick envelope with a return address from the Territorial Bank of Wyoming Cheyenne office. Ellis took it from the man's hand with the specific flatness of expression he used when something was happening that he didn't yet want to react to. He put it on his desk. He went back to the range. She knew because she'd seen it on his way through. She didn't ask. But at supper, he barely ate, which he never did. Ellis Brand ate with the reliable appetite of a man whose relationship with food was practical and consistent, and not eating was as legible on him as shouting would have been on another man. Garrett noticed too. She caught the old hand looking at Ellis across the table, with the alert watchfulness of someone who has known a person long enough to read their silences. After supper, after the men were out, Ellis came and stood in the kitchen doorway. She was at the stove, and she turned before he spoke because the floorboard had told her he was there. "The bank," he said, "has sent me a notice." She kept her voice even. "What kind of notice?" "The kind where they remind you what you owe, and suggest that your current rate of repayment is insufficient, and that they would like to discuss your situation." He said the last three words with a flatness that told her someone had used those exact words in the letter and they had not sat well with him. She dried her hands. "May I read it?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he went to his study and came back with the letter and put it on the table. She read it. It was worse than insufficient repayment. The bank, the Cheyenne office, which was not the branch that had issued the original loan. That had been the Caldwell office, had apparently purchased a collection of regional agricultural debts as part of a consolidation that someone in Cheyenne had decided was good business. Ellis's loan was now one of those debts. The letter was signed by a man named Harlan Voss, who held the title of Regional Credit Director, and it used the language of suggestion and conversation while meaning something considerably more pointed. They wanted him in Cheyenne within 30 days to discuss the terms. 30 days was the middle of December. She set the letter down. She thought about what she'd seen in the ledger. She ran the numbers in her head not quickly because this was not the kind of arithmetic you did quickly if you wanted to do it right. "The loan amount," she said. "Against what the ranch produces in a full year, in a good year, what's the ratio?" he told her. She nodded slowly. "That's not an impossible number." "It's not where I am right now." "No, but it's not where you'd need to be to make a case." She looked at him. If someone were to read those books carefully and present the ranch's actual productive capacity, not what the last 2 seasons have been, which were unusual, but what this land can sustainably produce, the numbers are different. Ellis looked at her. "You think a bank in Cheyenne is going to listen to that argument? I think a bank in Cheyenne is going to listen to facts organized by someone who knows what they're talking about." She paused. "Do you want to go to Cheyenne and tell them you're behind on payments and hope they're feeling generous? Or do you want to go to Cheyenne with a case?" A long silence. "Can you build a case?" he asked. She looked at him, and she thought about Daniel, about the road she'd watched him walk to the end without looking at it. And she thought about her own road out of Caldwell, 6 weeks ago, with 12 cents and a hole in her boot. And she thought about how far she'd come from that fence post. And she thought, not this time. Not again. "Give me 2 weeks and access to everything you have," she said. "Every record, every bill of sale, every yield count going back as far as you can give me. I'll build you a case." He held her eyes for a long moment. "All right," he said. But she did not stop cooking while she built the case. She was clear-eyed about that. The kitchen was not optional. The men needed feeding. The ranch needed its daily function. But she reorganized her time with the specific efficiency of a woman who has learned to work with limited resources. She woke earlier. She slept later. She cooked in larger batches, planned the week's meals at the beginning of the week, and carved out 2 to 3 solid hours each day at the desk Ellis had cleared for her in the corner of his study, which was a thing she registered without commenting on, because commenting on it would have made it bigger than she could afford for it to be right now. The records went back 8 years. The first 4 before Clara's death were in a different hand, organized with a neatness and consistency that told her something about the woman who'd kept them. Clara Brand had known what she was doing with numbers. The records after were in Ellis's hand, messier, less organized, the records of a man keeping track of things because they had to be kept track of rather than because he understood what the keeping was for. She built a picture from both sets. The ranch's productive capacity at full function was considerable. The land was good. The cattle, when managed at the right numbers, yielded well. The problem was not the land or the cattle. The problem was 3 things: the loan terms, which were aggressive, 2 consecutive bad seasons, which were real but anomalous, and the operational costs, which had drifted upward over 3 years in the specific way costs drift when no one is watching them. That last one she could show had already been addressed. The feed supply change alone would save a measurable amount annually. The other adjustments she'd made and proposed would add to that. She could show the trajectory where the ranch had been, where it was now, where it would be in 12 months if the current corrections held. She built it into a document organized section by section, written in the plain language that she knew from watching her father deal with banks was the language banks actually listened to. Numbers, dates, projections, the specific logical chain of cause and effect that left no room for interpretation. She finished the first draft on a Tuesday night at close to midnight. She sat back and read it through. It was good. She knew it was good the way you know a thing when you've put real work into it and it has come out right. Not perfect, she'd revise it, but sound. She put it down and went to the kitchen for water, and she found Ellis there standing at the stove in the near dark, his hands around a coffee mug, looking at nothing. "You should be sleeping," she said. "Couldn't?" he said. She poured water. She sat down at the table. After a moment he sat down too across from her, and they were in the same configuration as all those ledger nights, the lamp low between them, the house quiet around them. "It's done," she said. "The first draft. I'll go over it again tomorrow. It's solid, Ellis." She'd used his first name without meaning to. She registered it a half-second after. He registered it too. She could see it in the brief change in his expression, something that opened and then carefully closed again. But he didn't remark on it. "You believe it," he said. "The case you've built." "I wouldn't hand it to you if I didn't." He turned the mug in his hands. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said in a voice that was lower than his usual speaking voice and had something careful inside it. "When you came here, when I asked you that question at the fence, I want to be honest with you about this. I was not in a good way. I was doing what needed doing every day, but I had stopped seeing past the day. Does that make sense to you?" "Yes," she said quietly. "You changed that." He looked up. "And I don't mean the food or the kitchen or even these books. I mean something about this house started feeling worth coming back to, worth planning for." He stopped. His jaw worked once. "I'm not saying this right." She held very still. "You're saying it fine. I don't want you to leave when the thing with Cheyenne is settled. Whatever happens." The kitchen held that sentence for a moment. She thought about the facts she'd laid out for herself at 4 in the morning a week ago. She thought about how far those facts had gotten her. "I don't want to leave," she said. He looked at her directly. Something shifted in his expression, not relief exactly, but the release of something he'd been holding in position with significant effort. "All right," he said. And then they both sat there in the kitchen in the low lamplight and said nothing more because it didn't need more, And she thought, this is the most honest conversation I have had with a man since before Daniel got sick, and it was conducted almost entirely in 4 words at a time, and it was enough. She revised the document. She went over it 3 times. On the 4th reading, she found 2 errors in the projections minor, but she corrected them because minor errors in a document meant to persuade a banker are not minor. And on the 5th reading, she was satisfied. She brought it to Ellis on a Thursday afternoon, the full thing, 16 pages written in her clear hand on paper she'd asked him to bring from Caldwell. He read it at his desk while she stood near the window and didn't watch him. She could hear the sound of pages turning. He read slowly, which she'd expected he was reading to understand not to get through it. He finished. He sat back. "Nora," he said. She looked at him. "This is—" He put his hand on the document. He stopped. He was not a man who had many words for the moments when words were what the moment required. She watched him work on it. "This is the ranch as I know it should be," he said finally. "Not the way it's been. The way it always should have been. You found that." Something warmed in her so broadly she had to look away. "The numbers were there," she said. "I just organized them." "Don't do that," he said. She looked back at him. "Don't reduce it," he said. "Take the credit for what you did." She held his gaze for a moment. "All right," she said. "I built you a good case." "Yes," he said. "You did." The news about Harlan Voss arrived before Harlan Voss did. Garrett brought it in from Caldwell on a Saturday, picked up from the post, along with the weekly supplies, a second letter. This one shorter, stating that Mr. Voss would be coming to the ranch directly rather than waiting for Ellis in Cheyenne. He would arrive in approximately 10 days. He expected to examine the property and review the situation on site. Ellis read the letter at the kitchen table and said nothing. Nora read it after him and said nothing either for a moment. Then, "He's coming here to see whether it's worth saving or worth taking." Ellis looked at her. "You think he'd rather take it?" "I think a man who travels from Cheyenne to a working ranch in November to do what could be done in an office is a man who has made up his mind about something and wants to make sure the something is worth his effort." She set the letter down. "But he hasn't read what I've written." Ellis held her gaze. "No," he said. "He hasn't." "Let him come," she said. "We're ready." She said "we" without thinking about it. Ellis didn't flinch at it. Neither of them acknowledged it the same way they were getting very good at not acknowledging the things they both heard. But Garrett, who had stayed in the kitchen doorway long enough to hear that last exchange, turned and went out with the specific expression of a man who has just confirmed something he already knew. She spent the next 10 days with one eye on the kitchen and one eye on the document. Not revision, she'd done that. Preparation. She thought about every weakness in the argument and found answers for each. She thought about what a bankman from Cheyenne would object to, and she built preemptive responses. She talked to Ellis in the evenings after supper, and she asked him questions about the history of the land and the specific circumstances of the bad seasons and the decisions that had led to the decisions, and he answered them, all of them, with a candor she hadn't entirely expected, because she understood it was not easy for him laying out his errors alongside his reasoning, but he did it anyway because he had decided to trust her, and he honored that decision even when it cost him. She respected that more than she could have said. On the 4th evening of this, he said, "Ask me something that isn't about the ranch." She looked up from the paper in front of her. "What? You've been asking me questions for 4 nights. Ask me something that isn't numbers." She looked at him for a moment. "All right." She thought about it. "What was the thing that made you decide to stay on this land? The real thing, not the thing you told me before about not wanting to be wrong." He was quiet for a moment, long enough that she wondered if the question had gone too deep. "There was a morning," he said, "in my first spring here, before I owned it. I was up before anyone just to walk the property the way I did sometimes when I needed to think. And the light came in from the east across the grass, and it was just right. The way some things are for no reason that makes sense, just exactly as they should be." He paused. I thought if I can spend enough mornings in a place like this, my life will have been something. That's all. That's the whole thing. She looked at him. That's not the answer of a man who's only thinking about cattle prices, she said. No, he agreed. She looked back at her papers. Her heart was doing something she was managing with some difficulty. For what it's worth, she said, keeping her voice careful, this land is worth every morning you've given it. He looked at her across the table, and she didn't look up again, because she didn't trust her own face right now, but she felt his gaze the way you feel warmth from a fire when you've been cold, specific and generous, and reaching across the distance between things. You can ask me something back, she said. That isn't about the ranch. He was quiet for a moment. Are you happy here? He asked. She did look up then. He was watching her with that direct, unguarded look, the look he used when he wanted to know something truly, and was willing to let her see that he wanted to know. She thought about the morning she'd walked out of Caldwell, the 12 cents, the hole in the boot, the fence post, and the cold air, and the fact that she'd been so hollow, she'd nearly fallen. She thought about now. Yes, she said, simply, honestly. I didn't expect to be, but yes. He nodded. Something settled in his expression, the final settling of something that had been trying to find its place for weeks. Good, he said. And that was everything, and it was enough. And she looked back at her papers, and he looked at his coffee, and the house held them both in its warmth and silence, and didn't ask for anything more than what they were already giving it. Harlan Voss arrived on a Wednesday morning. She knew he was coming before she heard the horse because she had been listening for him for 2 days, and she had a specific feeling between her shoulder blades that had gotten sharper since breakfast. She was in the kitchen. She heard Ellis cross the front room. She heard the door. She stayed in the kitchen. She heard the voice, a city voice, the particular flatness of a man who uses words as instruments rather than expression. And she heard Ellis's voice in return, lower controlled, with the specific neutrality of a man who has decided in advance how this conversation will be conducted. After a few minutes, Ellis appeared in the kitchen doorway. He'd like to come inside and review things here, Ellis said. His eyes said something more, and what they said was, stay close. She nodded. She put the kettle on. She picked up the document from the shelf where she'd been keeping it and held it in her hands and waited. When Harlan Voss walked into the kitchen, she assessed him in the 4 seconds before he assessed her. He was 50 or thereabouts, with the particular well-tended look of a man who has never done physical labor and has stopped pretending to have any relationship with the people who do. His eyes went around the kitchen, the organized shelves, the clean stove, the bread cooling on the rack, and then to her with the expression of a man trying to place a piece that doesn't fit his picture. This is Nora Cassidy, Ellis said. She manages the house and the books. Voss looked at her. The books, he said with the specific tone of a man who is deciding whether to take that seriously. Nora held out the document. Mr. Voss, I've prepared a complete financial and operational analysis of the Brand Ranch. She let him take it. I think you'll find it answers most of the questions your letter raised. He looked at the document. He looked at her. He looked at Ellis. Something behind his eyes recalculated. Why don't we sit down? He said. They sat. She poured coffee because coffee gave hands something to do, and she needed Voss's hands occupied while his eyes were on her work. She sat across from him at the table, and Ellis sat at the end, not apart from her, she noticed. Not at the head of the table, asserting authority from a distance. At the near end. Beside her, in effect, in the way that told Voss and her exactly where Ellis Brand stood on the question of who was on which side of this table. She watched Voss read. She had done this before. Watched people read something she'd written and tried to see what they thought by the movement of their eyes. Voss was a controlled reader. He kept his face assembled. But she saw the moment on page 4, when something in his posture shifted a slight change in how his shoulders were carrying themselves, a micro-adjustment that said he'd encountered something he hadn't expected. He kept reading. When he was done, he set the document down with a precision that was different from how he'd picked it up. This is thorough, he said. Yes, she said. The projected recovery timeline. He tapped a page. This is dependent on the feed supply correction holding. The previous supplier has been terminated and replaced. I can provide the new contract if you'd like to review it. A pause. You have the contract. I have all of the contracts. She laid her hands on the table. Mr. Voss, I understand why your office is concerned. 2 difficult seasons and a loan structure that was written for full production terms. I also understand that your office's interest is in recovery, not in action for its own sake. The numbers I've laid out show a ranch that is not in permanent distress. It's in a correctable position, and the corrections have already begun. Voss looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Ellis. Your cook wrote this, he said. It was not quite a question. My bookkeeper, Ellis said. His voice was entirely flat and entirely final. Who also cooks? Another pause. Voss looked back at the document. Outside, the wind pushed at the house which held. The stove ticked to itself. Somewhere in the walls, the warmth that she had been building into this place for 2 months moved through the spaces between the timbers and held everything upright. Voss turned to page 12. Then page 13. His finger moved across a row of numbers. She watched and kept her breathing steady and thought, I built this right. I know I built this right. She waited for him to find it too. Voss turned to page 14. He was quiet for a long time. The kitchen held its breath the way a room does when something important is being decided inside it. The stove ticked. The wind moved against the walls. Ellis sat at the end of the table with his coffee and did not speak, which was the right thing, and she was grateful for it. Then Voss set the document down and folded his hands on top of it. Mrs. Cassidy, he said, this projection assumes a 17% increase in annual yield based on the feed and management corrections you've outlined. Yes, that's an aggressive assumption. It's a conservative one, she said. The land's documented output in the 4 years prior to the loan, which you'll find on page 3, averaged 22% above current yield. I projected 17. I wanted to give you a number I could defend, not a number that looks good. Voss looked at page 3. She watched him check her arithmetic, which she had expected and had made sure was precise to the penny. He looked up. You said the previous supplier has been terminated. 6 weeks ago. And the new arrangement is, on page 15, full contract signed with the per-head cost comparison on the page before it. He turned to page 15. He read it. He turned to page 14 and read the comparison. His expression didn't change, but his jaw shifted once slightly, and she read that as the expression of a man who has just found out that someone has done his job better than he would have. Then he closed the document. He looked at Ellis. I'd like to walk the property. Ellis stood. I'll take you. Voss stood. He picked up the document. He looked at Nora. I'll want to discuss some of these figures further. I'll be here, she said. They went out. She poured herself coffee and sat at the table and put both hands around the mug and let herself breathe. The document was good. She knew it was good. But good documents and favorable outcomes were not the same thing, and she understood that. And she understood that Harlan Voss had come here with a purpose that a good document might redirect, but might not stop entirely depending on what that purpose was. She needed to know what that purpose was. She got up and went to Ellis's study. She was not looking for anything in particular. She was looking for whatever was there to be found, which was a different kind of looking, the kind that requires you to be open to surprise rather than confirmation. She had been in this study every day for 2 weeks, and she knew its contents well. But she went through them again now with the specific question in mind: what does Harlan Voss actually want from this ranch? The original loan documents. She pulled them out and read them again, this time not for the numbers, but for the language. Legal language in financial documents is like a room where the furniture has been arranged to direct you in a specific direction. If you pay attention, you can feel where it's pushing you. This document was pushing toward something. She found it on page 4 in a clause she had read before, but interpreted differently. A provision about collateral. The loan was secured against the land, not the cattle, not the equipment, the land itself, which was standard. But there was a secondary clause in smaller print that she had previously read as boilerplate, and now reading it with the question in mind, read differently. The clause gave the bank the right in the event of non-payment to take title to the land rather than entering into a foreclosure proceeding. Faster, cleaner, and specifically worded in a way that removed Ellis's right to a public sale, which would normally allow him to recover the difference between the debt and the market value of the property if the land sold for more than what was owed. She read it 3 times. Then she sat back and thought about a bank in Cheyenne that had bought up regional agricultural debts and the man who'd come here not to discuss payment terms but to walk the property. She thought about the railroad. She put the loan document down and went to the shelf where Ellis kept his correspondence and found not immediately, but after several minutes, a letter from 8 months ago from a land agent in Casper asking whether Ellis had considered selling a portion of his northeast acreage. She almost put it aside before she registered the name of the company. The agent represented Westward Territorial Holdings. She held the letter and thought carefully. She went back to the loan document. She looked at the date the loan had been transferred to Voss's office in Cheyenne. She looked at the date of the land agent's letter. She looked at the names. She didn't have everything, but she had enough to understand the shape of it. She put the documents back precisely as she'd found them and went back to the kitchen and stood at the stove and thought about what to do with what she knew. Ellis and Voss were outside for 45 minutes. When they came back in, Voss had the look of a man who had confirmed something he'd gone looking for. Ellis had the look of a man who had been watching Voss and had his own thoughts about what Voss had been confirming. Nora put coffee on the table. She put the document in front of Voss's place. She sat down. Voss sat. He picked up his coffee. He looked at Ellis. "The northeast acreage," he said. "What are you running up there?" Ellis looked at him steadily. "Cattle, same as the rest. The grade of that land is different from the south section. Better drainage, closer to the rail corridor." He paused. "Have you had any inquiries about it?" Ellis said nothing for a moment. Nora watched him. She could see the moment he understood the specific change that happened behind his eyes when a man realizes the conversation he's been having is not the conversation he thought he was having. "Some," Ellis said. "From whom?" "Land agents. I did not pursue it." Voss nodded slowly, the nod of a man confirming. "The bank would be willing to consider a restructured arrangement," he said. "Reduced repayment terms, extended timeline in exchange for no." Voss stopped. Ellis had said it the same way he said everything he meant, completely quietly, without heat, without ambiguity. He set his coffee mug down. He looked at Voss. "If the offer involves the northeast acreage, the answer is no. Say the rest of what you came to say." Voss looked at him for a moment. Something behind his polished expression recalculated. He looked at the document. He looked at Nora. "The bank's position," he said carefully, "is that the current repayment trajectory is insufficient to service the debt within the remaining term." "The document I've prepared addresses that," Nora said. "Page 7 through 9. The adjusted trajectory shows full servicing within term if the corrections already in place hold." "If they hold?" Voss said. "If she agreed, which is why I've included the contracts and the documented yield history, to show that the adjustments are not projections. They're already in effect." Voss tapped the document. "There's a gap between what this shows and what the bank requires for the account to be considered current." "How large a gap?" she said. It was not a question. He told her. She had expected a number. The number he gave was larger than she'd expected. She kept her face still. She did the arithmetic in her head how the gap had grown, why it was larger than the ledger showed what the difference represented. Then she understood. She looked at Voss directly. "That figure includes fees that aren't in the original loan agreement." Voss looked at her. "Standard administration fees applied during the portfolio transfer." "The transfer of the loan to your office." "Correct." "Show me the schedule of those fees," she said. A pause. "They're standard." "Show me the schedule." she said again, in exactly the same tone, which was the tone of a woman who will wait as long as it takes. Voss reached into his case and produced a document. He put it on the table. She picked it up. She read it. The fees were not standard. Some of them were. But 3 line items, she found them within 2 minutes because she'd been looking for exactly this kind of thing since she'd read the loan agreement in Ellis's study, were applied at rates that were not in the original loan agreement and were not disclosed in the transfer letter Ellis had received. They were buried in a supplementary schedule that she doubted Ellis had been given or asked for. She put the fee schedule down. She looked at Voss. She kept her voice completely level. "These 3 items," she said, and she put her finger on each one. "Show me where in the original loan agreement these fee categories are authorized." Voss looked at the page. He looked at her finger. He looked at the loan agreement that she had placed on the table beside the fee schedule, already open to the relevant sections, because she had brought it from the study when she came back to the kitchen on the instinct that she might need it. He said nothing. "I'll find it for you if you'd like," she said. "But I've read that agreement 4 times, and I don't believe those fee categories appear in it." The kitchen was very quiet. Ellis was looking at Voss with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not anger, not exactly, but the cold clarity of a man who has realized he has been taken advantage of and is deciding precisely how to respond to that information. "Nora," he said. His voice was even. "What does that mean for the gap?" She did the arithmetic. If you remove the 3 unauthorized fees, the gap is approximately 40% of the figure Mr. Voss stated. She looked at Voss. "Which is within the range that my documents projected recovery addresses, without requiring any asset transfer." Voss looked at the loan agreement. He looked at the fee schedule. He looked at the document she had prepared. He looked at her. She could see him making a calculation that had nothing to do with numbers. What happened next took 2 hours and felt like 5. Voss did not immediately concede anything. That was not how men like Voss operated, and she had not expected it. What he did was engage seriously, specifically, point by point, and that engagement told her that he understood she had found something real, and that the conversation had changed. He questioned the fee categorization. She cited specific language from the loan agreement. He suggested an alternative interpretation of that language. She showed him why the alternative interpretation didn't hold, given the syntax of the clause in question, which she had looked up in a book of contract law she'd found in Ellis's study 3 days ago when she'd first suspected something like this might come up. Ellis had said that evening, "Where did you find that?" She'd said, "Your shelf, back left behind the surveying manual." He'd said, "I've never opened it." She'd said, "I know, it had dust on the spine." He had looked at her with an expression she had been trying not to catalog and had cataloged anyway. That book was now on the kitchen table, open to the relevant page, and Voss was reading it with the expression of a man who has arrived at a place he did not intend to arrive at. He tried 3 more angles. She answered each one not aggressively, not with triumph, just with the facts. She had the facts. She had organized the facts. She had anticipated the questions because she had spent 2 weeks living inside this problem, and she understood its shape better than Voss did, because understanding the shape of a problem is what happens when you care about the outcome, and Voss did not care about this ranch. He cared about the northeast acreage and what it was worth to Westward Territorial Holdings. She didn't say that out loud. She didn't need to. It was clear to everyone at the table. At the end of the 2nd hour, Voss sat back. He looked at Ellis. "The bank will need to review the fee schedule matter with its legal office before—" "How long?" Ellis said. 2 weeks. Possibly 3. "During which time?" Ellis said. "The account status." Voss paused. "Would remain as is. Pending review." "In writing," Nora said. Both men looked at her. "The agreement to pause collection action while the fee dispute is under review," she said. "In writing, today before you leave." Another pause. Longer. "I don't have the authority to—" You have the authority to write a letter on bank letterhead stating that the account is under internal review and no action will be taken pending resolution, she said, which is accurate and which your office would need to do anyway as a matter of record once you file the fee dispute internally. She kept her eyes on him. It takes 10 minutes. I can find you paper. The kitchen was very quiet again. Then Harlan Voss, credit director, Cheyenne office, reached into his case for his pen.
That's it.
He wrote the letter. She watched every word. When he was done, she read it before Ellis signed the acknowledgement, and she asked for one change, a more specific language around the scope of the review, which Voss made without argument, which told her the fight had gone out of him. He left 20 minutes later. Nora stood at the kitchen window and listened to the horse, and then the silence after the horse, and then the silence that was just the ranch, just the wind and the cold, and the inhabited quiet of a working place that was still for now exactly what it had always been. Behind her, Ellis exhaled. It was the exhale of a man who has been holding something for a very long time. She turned around. He was standing in the middle of the kitchen with the letter in his hand and an expression on his face that was complicated relief. Yes, but other things underneath it. Things that had more to do with the last 2 hours than with the last 2 years. He came for the land, Ellis said. It was not a question. Yes. The northeast section, the rail corridor. That's my reading. She paused. There's a land company called Westward Territorial Holdings. They've been acquiring corridor properties. There's a letter in your correspondence from one of their agents 8 months ago. Ellis looked at her. You found that this morning. I found it this morning. He was quiet. She could see him putting together everything she'd seen: the timeline, the letter, the loan transfer, the inflated fees. She watched him arrive at the same conclusion she'd arrived at, and she watched his jaw tighten with it. They bought my loan, he said, to manufacture a default, to get the land without paying market value. That's what it looks like, she said. I can't prove all of it. But the fee irregularities are provable, and if those fees are removed, the manufactured crisis disappears with them. Ellis set the letter on the table. He looked at it. He looked at her. Nora. His voice had changed. Not the careful, measured tone of a man working a problem. Something rawer than that. If you hadn't been here. I was here, she said. If you hadn't looked at those records. If you hadn't found the clause, if you hadn't any of it. He stopped. His hand went to the back of a chair. I would have walked into that conversation without knowing what it was. He would have taken the land, or he would have taken terms that put it in his pocket within a year. I would have lost everything Clara and I built here. Everything I've... He stopped again. His voice had gone rough at the edges, and she understood what it cost him to let her hear that. She crossed the kitchen and she put her hand on the table, not on his hand, but beside it, close enough that he could feel it was there, without her pushing past what he was ready for. But you didn't, she said. Ellis, you didn't lose it. It's still here. He looked down at her hand beside his. He looked up at her. Because of you, he said. Because you let me help, she said. There's a difference. You could have kept me in the kitchen and handled this yourself, and a lot of men would have. You didn't. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face was making its way toward something she recognized. Something that required a kind of courage that had nothing to do with banks or legal clauses. Then Garrett's boots on the porch broke the moment 3 solid knocks of a man who has enough sense to make noise before entering a room, and the door opened, and Garrett came in and stopped reading the room, in the immediate way of someone who knows these two people well enough to know he's walked into the edge of something. Voss is gone, Garrett said. Yes, Ellis said. Good outcome. Working on it, Nora said. Garrett looked at her. He looked at Ellis. He looked at the letter on the table. He poured himself coffee, said, "Good," and took it back out to the porch, closing the door with the specific care of a man demonstrating that he has excellent judgment. Ellis looked at the closed door. Then he looked at Nora. The raw edge was still in his expression, but there was something else alongside it now, the warmth of amusement, brief and real. "He knocked," Ellis said. "He's a thoughtful man," she said. Ellis smiled. She had seen this happen before, the small controlled version, the thing at the corner of his mouth. But this time, it reached his eyes, fully without reservation. She hadn't seen that yet. She thought, there you are. She looked at the letter on the table. "We're not finished," she said. "The review could go wrong. The legal office might uphold the fees. We need to be ready for that." "I know." His voice was steady again, practical. "What do you need?" "The original loan agreement filed somewhere safe. Copies of everything in the document I prepared. And I want to write a letter to a land law practice in Cheyenne." She paused. "Do you know anyone there?" He thought. "The minister and Caldwell's brother practices there. I've met him twice." "Is he honest?" "I believe so." "Write him," she said. "Tonight. Tell him what we found and ask if he'd review the loan agreement. We may not need him. I'd rather have him and not need him." Ellis nodded. He picked up the bank letter. He held it for a moment. Then he said quietly, "You know this ranch better than I do in some ways. The numbers, the contracts, the shape of it." He looked at her. "How did that happen?" She considered the question. "I paid attention," she said. "And I cared what happened to it. Why?" The word came out simply, genuinely, not demanding, just a man who wanted to understand. She looked at him steadily. "Because it mattered to you," she said. "And you started to matter to me. Earlier than was probably wise." The kitchen held very still. Ellis Brand looked at her with an expression that was completely unguarded for the first time since she had known him. No caution in it, no careful management of what he let her see. Just a man hearing something true and letting it land. "I see," he said. His voice was quiet and deliberate. "I should tell you." And then Teddy knocked hard and urgent, and opened the door without waiting and said, "Mr. Brand, there's something wrong with the Hereford in the north barn. She's gone down, and we can't get her up." Ellis closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Then he put the letter down. He looked at Nora. She gave him a small nod. "Go, it's all right. We'll finish this," and he went. She stood in the kitchen alone. She put both hands flat on the table and breathed. She had said it. She had said it out loud, not entirely on purpose, but she had said it, and it was true, and she did not want to take it back. She was afraid of what he'd been about to say when Teddy knocked. She was more afraid that she wasn't afraid enough that the thing she'd been keeping at a careful distance had walked up to her while she was busy and was now standing close enough to touch. She started on supper, hands busy, mind occupied. The specific discipline of a woman who has learned to do the next thing when the current thing is too large to hold. But the kitchen was warm. It was warm in a way that had nothing to do with the stove. Ellis came back 2 hours later. The Hereford was all right. A bad fall, nothing broken, she'd need watching, but she would recover. He came in, tired coat still on, and stopped in the kitchen doorway. Supper was on the table waiting. She'd held it. She'd known he'd come back hungry, and she'd held it. He looked at the table. He looked at her. He took off his coat. He sat down. He picked up his fork. Then he said without looking up, "You said you cared what happened to this ranch because I mattered to you." She was at the stove. She didn't turn around. "I did say that." "Earlier than was probably wise was how you put it." "Yes." "I've been unwise in the same direction," he said, "for longer than I've admitted to myself." She turned around then. He was looking at her. Directly, completely the way he'd looked at her over the fence on that first day. But different, because on that first day he'd been trying to understand what was in front of him, and now he understood it and was simply letting her see that he understood it. "I don't know how to do this well," he said. "I've been alone long enough that I've forgotten how to say things while there's still time to say them." "You're saying it now," she said. "I am," he agreed. "Is it—" He stopped. "Is it too late to have started sooner?" She looked at him for a moment. The man who had asked her a quiet question at a fence post and changed the direction of her life. The man who had read her ledger analysis without defensiveness and ridden with her to Caldwell and listened to her with the full attention of someone who took her seriously. The man who put his spot at the end of the table closer to her side without saying a word about it. "No," she said. "It's not too late." He exhaled. Once. The second exhale she'd seen from him today, and this one undid something in her chest that she hadn't been sure would ever come undone again. "Good," he said. "Sit down then. Eat with me." It was not poetry. It was not a declaration. It was a man asking a woman to sit at his table and eat supper with him, which was the most specific and domestic and real thing he could have said, and she loved it for exactly that reason. She sat down. They ate supper together at the kitchen table, while the wind moved around the house, and the stove ticked, and the ranch held its ground in the dark, exactly as it had been built to do, with someone at last paying proper attention. They wrote the letter to the Cheyenne attorney that same night. Ellis drafted it at his desk, while Nora sat across from him and told him what to include. Not the emotional version, not the story of a man who'd been maneuvered by a bank with a land agenda, but the clean, factual version. The one that a lawyer would need. The loan date, the transfer date, the 3 unauthorized fee categories, the specific clause in the original agreement that contradicted them, the dollar figure of the discrepancy. She dictated and he wrote, and when it was done, she read it over once and said, "Add the name of the land company." And he looked at her and then added it without asking how she'd connected that particular thread, because by now, he knew she didn't make connections without grounds for making them. He sealed it. He would send it to Caldwell with Garrett in the morning. They sat for a moment after both of them, feeling the particular stillness of people who have done what can be done for one day and are now waiting for the world to respond. "What's the worst outcome?" Ellis said. Not anxiously practically. He was a man who preferred to look at worst outcomes directly rather than let them come at him sideways. She thought about it honestly. "The legal office upholds the fees. The attorney in Cheyenne tells us the clause doesn't hold the way I've read it. Voss comes back with the full figure and a shorter timeline. And then we fight it differently. A foreclosure proceeding is public. A public sale means you recover the difference between the debt and market value. They don't want that a public sale would expose what they were trying to do. They want a quiet title transfer, which is why they built the loan the way they did." She paused. "If we make enough noise, the thing they're trying to do quietly becomes very loud. That's leverage." Ellis looked at her for a long moment. "You've thought through the whole board." "I've been thinking through the whole board since I read that land company letter this morning." He nodded slowly. Then, with the slight shift in his expression that meant something had moved in him that had nothing to do with strategy. "You're not afraid of any of it, are you?" "I'm afraid of all of it," she said. "I just don't let it make the decisions." He looked at her the way he'd looked at her at supper directly, and without the usual careful management, and then he looked at the sealed letter on the desk. "Get some sleep," he said. "You've been working since before I got up this morning." She stood. She was tired in a way that went all the way down. "So have you." "I'll be up a little longer." She stopped at the door. She looked back at him, the lamplight on his face, the letter under his hand, the expression of a man who had more to carry than he ever said, and was carrying it better than he had been 2 months ago. "Ellis," she said. He looked up. "It's going to be all right," she said. Not as comfort, as her honest assessment of the odds. He held her gaze. "I know," he said, and then quieter, "because you're going to make sure it is." She went to bed and slept harder than she had in weeks. Garrett rode to Caldwell the next morning with the letter and came back that afternoon with a response that was faster than any of them had expected. Not from the attorney who wouldn't have received it yet, but from the church minister's wife who had apparently spoken to her brother-in-law by telegraph that very morning about a different matter entirely, and mentioned in passing that a woman at the Brand Ranch had found irregularities in a bank loan document. The minister's wife was named Helen Pratt, and she arrived at the ranch at 4 o'clock in the afternoon in a buggy. She drove herself with the specific energy of a woman who has information and intends to deliver it personally. She came into the kitchen. Everyone came into the kitchen. Nora had long since stopped being surprised by this, and sat down without ceremony and said, "My brother-in-law knows the name Harlan Voss." Nora poured coffee. "How does he know it?" "Professionally." There are 2 other properties in the territory where Voss's office has initiated collection proceedings in the last 18 months. Both involved loan transfers from regional banks. Both involved land near the rail corridor. Helen Pratt looked at Nora with the clear assessing gaze of a woman who deals in information and knows its value. In one case, the farmer accepted restructured terms that included a land transfer. In the other, the farmer simply left. Walked away from 30 years of work because he didn't know he could fight it. The kitchen was very quiet. Ellis, who had come in from the barn when Garrett mentioned there was a visitor, was standing near the door with the stillness of a man absorbing something large. "How many properties?" he said. "That we know of," Helen said. "At least 4 in the last 2 years, possibly more. My brother-in-law said the pattern is consistent enough that he's been watching it but hasn't had a clear case. The fee irregularities you found." She looked at Nora. "He said that's the clearest evidence yet of deliberate construction." Nora set her coffee down. "He can use our documents. He wants to, with Ellis's permission. He believes that with your case as the foundation, he can file a complaint with the Territorial Banking Authority that forces a full audit of Voss's office." Helen paused. "He also said, and I want to be direct about this, that it will take time and it will make Voss uncomfortable, and uncomfortable men with institutional backing sometimes push back hard before they fold." She looked at Ellis when she said that last part. Ellis looked at Nora. Nora said, "Tell your brother-in-law yes." Ellis said, "Yes." Helen Pratt finished her coffee, declined the supper invitation with genuine regret, and drove herself back to Caldwell in the dark. At the door she stopped and looked at Nora and said quietly, so that Ellis on the other side of the room couldn't hear, "You have a good head, and you used it well. That man would have lost everything without you knowing what to look for." "He would have fought for it either way," Nora said. Helen looked at her for a moment. "Yes, but fighting blind is a different thing from fighting with someone beside you who can see." She buttoned her coat. "Don't be careless with that, what you've got between you. Don't let the practical business of it crowd out the human business." She left before Nora could answer. The letter from the attorney arrived 4 days later. He had read the documents Garrett delivered. Ellis had sent copies the same day Helen Pratt visited, and his letter was 3 pages of the most precise legal language Nora had read since the loan agreement itself. His conclusion was unambiguous. The 3 fee categories were not authorized under the original loan agreement. The clause she had identified was clear. The discrepancy constituted an unlawful addition to the debt, and any collection action based on a figure that included those fees was in his considered opinion without legal foundation. He would represent Ellis Brand in the matter at a fee that was fair and structured to be paid once the situation was resolved. He also included on the last page a note that was less formal than the rest. The woman who organized these documents understood precisely what she was looking for and precisely why it mattered. In 20 years of practice, I have seen ranch families lose land to exactly this kind of manufactured crisis because they did not have someone in their corner who knew the difference between what a document says and what it means. You are fortunate. Do not waste it. Ellis read the letter at the kitchen table that evening. He read it once, then again. Then he put it down and looked at the wall for a moment. Then he looked at Nora. "He said you understood what you were looking for," Ellis said. "I grew up watching my father deal with men who write contracts with one meaning on the surface and another one underneath," she said. "He taught me to read the underneath." "Your father was a careful man. He was a suspicious man," she said, "which in certain circumstances amounts to the same thing." Ellis looked at the letter again. Something had shifted in his face over these last days, a settling, a laying down of something that had been held in tension for a long time. Not relief exactly, because the situation wasn't over yet. but a kind of solid ground under him that he hadn't had before she'd found that clause, before Helen Pratt had come with her information, before the attorney had written 3 pages of confirmation. "What do you want?" he said. It came out simply out of what seemed like nowhere, the way the real questions do when someone has finally cleared enough ground to ask them. She looked at him. "From the situation with the bank?" "No," he said. From this. From the life in front of you." "What do you want, Nora?" She thought about it honestly, the way she did everything. Not the safe answer, and not the reckless one, but the true one. "I want work that uses what I actually have," she said. "I want to be somewhere I can build something that lasts longer than a season. I want to stop losing things." She paused. "And I want to not be alone in the way I've been alone since Daniel got sick. Not the practical alone, I can manage that, the other kind." He was watching her. She kept going because she had started, and stopping now would be worse. "I want the thing that's been happening in this kitchen for 2 months to be what it actually is," she said. "Not managed. Not kept at a careful distance because the timing isn't right or the situation is complicated. I want it to be what it is." The kitchen held that. Ellis stood up from his chair. He came around the table, and he stood in front of her, and he was close enough that she had to look up to see his face, and what was in it was the same thing she'd seen the night Teddy knocked on the barn door, the unguarded thing. But there was no door about to open now, and no Hereford gone down, and no bank letter to interrupt them. "I should have said this weeks ago," he said. "You're saying it now," she said, same as she'd said before. "I am." He lifted his hand and he touched her face, just his thumb along her jaw. Careful and deliberate, the touch of a man who is not being impulsive, but has thought about this and decided it's right. "I love you," he said. "I know that's a plain way to put it." "It's the right way," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not as my cook, not as my bookkeeper, as my—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "I don't have a graceful way to say this." "Then say it plainly," she said. "That's how you say everything that matters." He looked at her. "Stay as my wife," he said. "If you'll have me. If that's—" He caught himself. "I'm not asking because of the bank or the ledger or the situation. I'm asking because I haven't wanted to come home to a place this much since Clara was alive, and what I've realized is that it's not the place. It never was the place." She reached up and put her hand over his, where it rested against her face. "Yes," she said. "That's my answer. Yes." Garrett knew before they said a word. He knew because he came in for breakfast the next morning and looked at the two of them in the kitchen, Ellis pouring coffee, Nora at the stove, the ordinary geography of the morning rearranged in some way that was invisible and completely legible, and he stood in the doorway and said, "Well," and then poured his own coffee and sat down. And that was the entirety of the announcement. Teddy knew because Garrett told him which Nora suspected within the hour, and confirmed when Teddy came in with his hat literally in his hands, and said with the earnest formality of a young man who has decided an occasion is important, "Mrs. Cassidy, I mean, congratulations. We're all real glad." She said, "Thank you, Teddy. Sit down and eat your eggs." He sat down. He ate his eggs. Then he said to his plate quietly, "My biscuits never were any good anyway. It's better this way." She felt something bright and unexpected move through her. She turned back to the stove before he could see her face. 2 weeks after that morning, the telegram from the attorney arrived. The Territorial Banking Authority had accepted the complaint and opened a formal audit of Voss's office. Pending the audit, all collection proceedings initiated by that office were suspended. Ellis Brand's account, along with the accounts of 3 other ranch families, was placed in a review status. That meant no action could be taken against any of them until the audit was complete. Voss would not be coming back. Ellis read the telegram at the kitchen table and then set it down and picked up his coffee and drank it and didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "It's over." "The audit isn't over," Nora said practically. "The threat is over," he said. "The thing that was hanging over this place. It's done. She sat down across from him. He was right. The formal resolution would take months. The audit, the findings, the likely return of the unlawful fees to the affected families, possibly regulatory action against Voss personally. But the immediate threat, the constructed crisis, the plan that had been designed to take this land quietly, while Ellis Brand didn't know what was happening to him that was done. She thought about the morning she had walked out of Caldwell with nothing. She thought about the fence post and the cold and the quiet question from a man on a gray roan horse. She thought about the kitchen as she'd first seen it neglected, accumulated without a woman's attention, and she thought about it now organized and warm and the center of a house that had come alive again. She thought about Clara Brand's Dutch oven on the stove finally being used for what it was made for. She thought about a man who had said "I love you" in the plainest way possible and meant every syllable. "Ellis," she said. He looked at her. "The northeast acreage," she said. "What would you do with it if you could do anything?" He thought about it. "Expand the herd. We're running below what that land can carry. In 3 years, if the feed management holds, we could increase the annual yield by—" "That's the practical answer," she said. He stopped. He looked at her with the look that meant she had said something that went deeper than he'd been going. "What's the other answer?" She smiled. "That's what I'm asking you." He was quiet for a moment. Then slowly, "There's a spot on that acreage where the land rises toward the north. You can see most of the ranch from there. The first spring I was on this property before I owned it, I used to walk up there in the early morning." He paused. "I thought about building something up there someday. Something small, not practical, just somewhere to stand and see the whole thing." She looked at him. "Then that's what we'll do," she said. "After the herd is expanded and the yield is where it should be, we'll build something up there." He looked at her for a long moment. "You said we." "I did," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand. Not dramatically, just the solid, certain grip of a man who has finally stopped letting the best things pass by while he was busy being careful. "All right," he said. December came in fully then, with the first real snow of the season. It came overnight, the way the best and worst things do, quietly, without announcement, transforming everything before anyone had decided whether they were ready. She woke to the specific silence of a world that has been covered, and she lay still for a moment and listened to it and felt the particular quality of a morning that has been changed by something permanent. She dressed and went to the kitchen and started the stove and made the coffee and looked at the window where the light came in different, softer, reflected the light of a world that had decided to be white for a while. Ellis was up 20 minutes later. He came in and stood at the window for a moment looking out. "First hard snow," he said. "Yes." He poured his coffee. He stood beside her at the stove. They were close enough that their shoulders were nearly touching the easy proximity of people who have stopped needing to calibrate the distance between them. "The men will need the west barn checked," he said. "I know. Go. Breakfast will be ready when you come back." He looked at her. Something in his face was very simple and very full, the expression of a man whose life has, after a long, difficult passage, arrived somewhere he recognizes. He put his coffee down. He kissed her forehead, careful and warm and deliberate, and then he went out. She stood at the stove and held that feeling for a moment, the way you hold something you're not sure you deserve, and then realize the deserving is not the question. The question is what you do with it now that it's yours. She made breakfast. That evening, the snow still falling in the soft, unhurried way of a storm that has all the time in the world, they stood on the porch together. She had her coat on and her good boots, both whole now, no holes, and Ellis stood beside her with his shoulder touching hers, and they looked at the ranch in the white and the quiet. The barn was lit from inside. The bunkhouse, too. Somewhere in there, Teddy was probably burning his biscuits as a backup plan. She had made enough bread to carry them through breakfast, and she'd told him so. But Teddy was a belt and suspenders person when it came to food, ever since the weeks before she arrived, when there had not been enough of it. Garrett would be at his bunk reading the almanac he kept beside it, planning the next month the way he always did, quietly, methodically, with the satisfaction of a man who likes to know what's coming. The ranch was full and working and warm in all the places that mattered. Ellis said, "You've been here 3 months." "Yes." "It seems longer." "Good longer or bad longer?" He turned to look at her. "Like it was always this way," he said. "Like the time before you was the strange part. And this is how it was supposed to be." She looked at him. The snow was coming down between them, and it didn't matter. It was just weather, and they were people who lived in weather and knew it couldn't touch what was already decided. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me." "When I walked out of Caldwell, that morning." She paused. She had not talked about that morning with him, not fully, not with the real weight of it. I was not sure I was going to be all right. Not in the way a person means when they say they're not sure, and they really mean they'll figure it out. I mean, I was not sure in the deep way that there was going to be enough of me left to make anything worth having. He was very still beside her. "And then you asked me a question," she said. "One question, and you didn't pity me, and you didn't make me explain myself, and you asked me a question that made me feel like a person who had something to offer, not a problem to be solved or a situation to be managed." She looked at him. "You don't know what that cost you to give me, or what it was worth to me, but I do. I've known since the first week." He looked at her for a moment. His jaw was tight in the way it gets when he's feeling something he doesn't know how to speak. Then he said, "I asked because I needed someone, but I kept you because—" He stopped. He started again. "You walked in and you looked at that kitchen like it was a thing worth fixing, not a disaster, not a burden, a thing worth your attention. And I thought—" He stopped again. "I thought that is how she sees everything. And I was right." She leaned into him. Not dramatically. Just the small, inevitable shift of her shoulder into his arm, the physical grammar of two people who have stopped pretending the distance is necessary. He put his arm around her. They stood in the snow, and the quiet and the specific warmth of standing next to a person you have chosen, and who has chosen you back. After a while, she said, "I was already home." He looked at her. "Before you asked me to stay," she said. "Before the ledger and the banker and all of it, I was already home. I just needed you to see it too." He held her a little tighter. He said, "I see it." The snow kept falling. The ranch held its ground around them solid and worked and real, the product of 12 years of a man's belief that a place could be worth something if you gave it enough of yourself. The kitchen light came through the window behind them and laid itself across the porch boards in a warm rectangle that said, "Here, this is the center. This is where the warmth starts." She thought about her mother's kitchen in Missouri, about the table she'd saved coins to buy that had been carried out the door by a man with a dead mustache, about 12 cents in a hem and a left boot with a hole, and the specific cold of an October morning that had turned out to be not the end of something, but the road to something she hadn't had the vocabulary for yet. She had the vocabulary now. 2 weeks before Christmas, a letter arrived from the Territorial Banking Authority confirming that the audit had uncovered systematic fee irregularities across 7 accounts managed by Voss's office. The unlawful fees would be reversed. Harlan Voss had been placed on administrative leave pending a full review of his practices. The Brand Ranch account showed a current balance once the fees were removed that was within the range Nora had projected in her document. Within term. Serviceable. Not comfortable, but solid, and solid was what they had, and solid was what they would build from. Ellis read the letter and handed it to Nora without a word. She read it and set it on the table and said, "We'll want to keep a copy of this with the other documents." "We will," he said. The we again. Natural. Unforced. The word that had replaced I sometime in the last 2 months without either of them making an announcement about it. Garrett was told formally that evening at supper. He said, "I know," and continued eating. Teddy, who had apparently also already known, looked deeply relieved that he was now allowed to stop pretending he didn't. The minister in Caldwell would marry them in January, which was practical. The roads would be manageable by then, the worst of the weather predictable, and January was a lighter month on the ranch before the spring push. Nora had no family close enough to notify in time, and she was not sorry about this in the way she thought she might be, because the people at this table were the people she was building the rest of her life with, and that was enough. She said as much to Ellis that night. He said, "The men are going to be insufferable about being in the wedding party." She said, "Garrett will be dignified. Teddy will cry." "Teddy absolutely will cry," she agreed. "And then he'll deny it." Ellis smiled, the full one, the one that reached his eyes, the one she'd been cataloging since the first time she saw it, and she thought, "I will spend the rest of my life earning that smile, and I will not find it a burden." On the last night of December, she sat at the kitchen table, long after everyone was asleep, and wrote a letter to her mother. Her mother who had been gone for 4 years, but to whom she still sometimes wrote letters, because the practice of thinking clearly enough to write is its own kind of prayer. She wrote about the kitchen, about the ledger and the banker and the documents and the fee clause, about Garrett and Teddy, and the Dutch oven, and the bread, and the 12 cents she'd sewn into her hem, that had turned out to be exactly enough to get her to a fence post in Wyoming Territory, where a man on a gray roan horse had asked her a question that changed everything. She wrote, "I did not come here looking for this. I came here looking for a place to put my feet while I figured out what was next. But home is not a place you find mama. It's a person who opens a door and asks you in and then keeps asking every day, in every small way, whether you will stay. Ellis asked me in, and I said yes. And I intend to keep saying yes for as long as he keeps asking, which I believe will be a very long time." She sealed the letter. She would not send it. It was not that kind of letter. She kept it with the photograph of her mother and the tinder box and the 12 cents which she had saved in a small tin on the shelf in her room. Their room now. Or it would be in January, because she wanted to remember what it felt like to have exactly 12 cents and a direction and nothing else, so that she would always know the difference between that and this. The difference was everything. The difference had a name and a face and a voice that said the things that mattered in the plainest words available, and that was more than she had ever thought to ask for, and exactly what she had always needed. She put the letter away. She went to the window for a moment and looked out at the dark of the ranch, the shapes of the barn and the bunkhouse, the fences going out into the black, the sky heavy with clouds that meant more snow before morning. Everything she had was here. Everything she was going to build was here. Home was never the house, and it was never the land, and it was never the money in the account or the security of a solved problem. It was the man who had been waiting without knowing he was waiting for someone to come and pay attention to the things he'd built and tell him they were worth saving. It was the woman who had come with nothing and found in the act of making something out of whatever was there that she had everything she needed. She went to bed. The ranch held them all through the night, solid and warm and sure of itself. A place that had been pulled back from the edge by a woman who knew the difference between what a document says and what it means, and by a man who had been wise enough when she arrived to simply open the door and ask her in. That was the whole of it. That was enough. That was home.